So, na-discuss na natin yung relevance and yung dalawang ingredients, predictive value and confirmatory value. Yung sub-quality ay materiality. So, discuss naman natin yung faithful representation and yung ingredients ng faithful representation, completeness, neutrality, and free from error. Yung pangalawa sa fundamental qualitative characteristics ay faithful representation. Faithful representation means that financial reports represent economic phenomena or transactions in words and numbers. Stated differently, the descriptions and figures must match what really existed or happened. So simply worded, faithful representation means that the actual effects of the transactions shall be properly accounted for and reported in the financial statement. Sa reference book natin, nasa page 59, sabi dyan, example, if the entity reports purchases of 5 million when the actual amount is 8 million, so the information would not be faithfully represented. Kasi kung magkano mo siya binili, yun dapat ang mag-reflect na amount niya din. Kung 5 million mo siya pinurchase, so 5 million siya dapat mag-reflect. Or kung 8 million mo siya pinurchase, 8 million siya dapat mag-reflect. To record the sale of merchandise as miscellaneous income would not also be a faithful representation of the sale transaction. To be a perfectly faithful representation, a depiction should have 3 characteristics, namely completeness, neutrality, and free from error. So yan yung ingredients of faithful representation. To be a perfectly faithful representation, a depiction should have 3 characteristics, namely completeness, neutrality, and free from error. So, yan yung ingredients of faithful representation. So, i-discuss natin ano yung completeness, neutrality, and free from error. So, yung unang ingredients ng faithful representation ay completeness. So, completeness requires that relevant information should be presented in a way that facilitates understanding and avoids erroneous implication. Completeness is the result of adequate disclosure, standard, or the principle of full disclosure. Completeness is the result of the adequate disclosure, standard, or the principle of full disclosure. So, a complete depiction includes all information necessary for a user to understand the phenomenon being depicted. So, including all necessary descriptions and explanations. So, for example, a complete depiction of a group of assets would include description of the assets, numerical depiction, and description of the numerical depiction such as cost, current cost, or fair value. So, ano ba yung standard of adequate disclosure? So, the standard of adequate disclosure means that all significant and relevant information to the preparation of financial statements shall be clearly reported. So, sabi dun sa reference book natin, page 60, adequate disclosure, however, does not mean disclosure of just any data. The accountant shall disclose a material fact known to him which is not disclosed in the financial statements but disclosure of which is necessary in order that the financial statements would not be misleading. So kaya nagkakaroon tayo ng notes to financial statements. Yung hindi mailagay sa financial statements, balance sheet, income statement, or cash flows, so meron tayong notes to financial statements. Actually, to be complete, the financial statement shall be accompanied by notes to financial statements. The purpose of the notes is to provide the necessary disclosure required by the Philippine Financial Reporting Standards. So, notes to financial statements provide narrative description or disaggregation of the items presented in the financial statement and information about items that do not qualify for recognition. Yung second ingredients ng faithful representation ay neutrality. A neutral depiction is without bias in the preparation or presentation of financial information. A neutral depiction is not slanted, weighted, emphasized, de-emphasized, or otherwise manipulated to increase the probability that financial information will be received favorably or unfavorably by users. So, in other words, to be neutral, the information contained in the financial statements must be free from bias. Okay? So, the financial information should not favor one party to the detriment of another party. So, the information is directed to the common users of many users and not to the particular needs of a specific users. So, sabi dyan, neutrality is synonymous with the all-encompassing principle of fairness. So, to be neutral is to be fair. Neutrality is supported by the exercise of prudence. So, ano ba yung prudence? So, the revised conceptual framework has reintroduced the concept of prudence. So, prudence is the exercise of care and caution when dealing with the uncertainties in the measurement process, such that assets or income are not overstated and liabilities or expenses are not understated. O, wag magkakamali ha. Income or assets are not overstated. Tapos yung liabilities or expenses are not understated. Yung prudence, guys, ay synonymous sa conservatism. Conservatism means that when alternatives exist, the alternative which has the least effect on equity should be chosen. So in other words, conservatism means in case of doubt, record any loss and do not record any gain. So, for example, if there is a choice between two acceptable asset values, the lower figure is selected. Kasi sabi natin, di ba, yung asset and yung income should not be overstated. So, accordingly, inventories are measured at the lower of cost and net realizable value, while contingent loss is recognized as a provision if the loss is probable and the amount can be reliably measured. So, nire-record na siya as provision yung contingent loss, while contingent gain is not recognized but disclosed only. It is to be emphasized that conservatism is not a license to deliberately understate net income and net assets. So, for example, if an entity has a cash of 500,000 and reports only 100,000, this is not conservatism but fraud or inaccurate reporting. So, ito yung makikita o madidinig nyo na expressions ng conservatism. Anticipate no profit and provide for probable and measurable loss. And don't count your chicks until the eggs hatch. So, yan yung conservatism or prudence. And yung last ingredients ng faithful representation ay free from error. So, free from error means there are no errors or omissions in the description of the phenomenon or transactions. Moreover, the process used to produce the reported information has been selected and applied with no errors in the process. So, free from error does not mean perfectly accurate in all aspects. For example, an estimate of an unobservable price or value cannot be determined to be accurate or inaccurate. However, a representation of that estimate can be faithful if the amount is described clearly and accurately as an estimate. Moreover, the nature and limitation of the estimating process are explained and no errors have been made in selecting and applying an appropriate process for developing the estimate. Measurement uncertainty. So, measurement uncertainty arises when monetary amount in financial reports cannot be observed directly and must instead be estimated. So, measurement uncertainty can affect faithful representation if the level of uncertainty in providing an estimate is high. However, the use of reasonable estimate is an essential part of providing financial information and does not undermine the usefulness of the financial information, as long as the estimate is clearly and accurately described and explained. Even a high level of measurement uncertainty does not affect the usefulness of the information. And yung last na diniscuss dyan sa faithful representation ay substance over form. So, if information is to represent faithfully the transactions and other events it purports to represent, it is necessary that the transactions and events are accounted in accordance with their substance and reality, not merely their legal form. The economic substance of transactions and events are usually emphasized when economic substance differs from legal form. So, substance over form is not considered a separate component of faithful representation because it would be redundant. Example of substance over form. So, an example is when the lessee leases property from the lessor. So, the terms of the lease provide that the lease transfers ownership of the asset to the lessee by the end of the lease term. But in form, the contract is a lease as popularly understood. But in substance, in reality, if the transfer of ownership provision is to be considered, the real intent of the parties is an installment purchase of an asset by the lessee from the lessor. So accordingly, the lessee shall record an acquisition of right of use of asset and set up a liability to the lessor. So the periodic rental is conceived as an installment payment representing interest and principal. So, di ba kapag may nakita kayo nakalagay for lease, so yun yung parang rent to own. Parang nirerentahan mo siya kada buwan, tapos pero pag nag-end na yung term ay mapupunta na sa yung property. So, parang nagiging installment yung pag-purchase mo sa kanya. So, nire-record na yun as asset and nagre-record na si lessee ng liability kay lessor. So, yan yung substance over form. So, yung ine-emphasize dyan ay yung substance over dun sa form. Para mas madaling maintindihan yung substance over form. Kunwari meron kang boyfriend, pinakilala mo dun sa kaibigan mo. So, tapos, after mo ipakilala, tinanong mo yung kaibigan mo. Sabi mo, yung boyfriend ko ba ay gwapo ba? Gwapo ba? Sabi nung kaibigan mo, mabait. Mukhang matalino. Tapos sasabihin mo, tinatanong ko kung gwapo ba? So, ang sasagot ng kaibigan mo, tandaan mo, meron tayong tinatawag sa accounting na substance over form. Okay?